Hello there, and welcome to Deep Unknown, a place where curiosity doesn't just whisper, it pulls you into the depths of forgotten worlds. Tonight, we open a door into a time before memory itself, before the first cities, before the lives we recognize as our own. We step into an age when Earth wore a very different face, and across its vast landscapes moved creatures so immense, so alien, they feel as though they belong to another planet. This is the story of the Pleistocene, an era when ice ruled the continents and giants truly walked the earth. These were not the giants of myths or fairy tales, but beings of flesh and bone, whose breath steamed in the frozen air, whose shadows stretched across endless plains. It was a world where winters spanned thousands of years, summers were fleeting, and survival was measured not in comfort, but in the sharpness of your instincts, the thickness of your fur, and the sheer will to endure. Before we drift into this age of deep time, take a moment to settle in. Maybe you're listening as the night folds over the world outside, or maybe sleep is already tugging at the edges of your thoughts. Wherever you are, let this story carry you, because the world we're about to revisit moved slowly too, changing not in years or decades, but over millennia. And if journeys like this spark your imagination, be grateful if you subscribed and shared this with others. Stories like these are kept alive when they're passed along, like firelight carried across the dark steps of history. So close your eyes if you'd like, or let them rest softly on something distant. Together, we'll walk backwards through the centuries, through the millennia, until we reach a world where your breath would freeze in the air, and the horizon ended not in mountains, but in walls of ice that seemed to touch the sky. The world before memory was not merely colder, it was vaster, harsher, and teeming with a kind of life that no longer exists. To imagine the Pleistocene is to picture Earth dressed in white, wrapped in the armor of an eternal winter. But the truth is far more complex, far more alive. It was a world where the laws of survival were written in ice and blood, where creatures did not simply endure, they thrived, colossal and unyielding, in conditions we would call impossible today. Picture, if you can, standing on what is now the Great Plains of North America, but in a time when there were no plains as we know them. Instead, there stretches before you an endless grassland, dotted with massive animals that move like living mountains across the landscape. The grass itself is different, tough and resilient, growing low to the ground where it can resist the constant wind that carries the scent of distant ice. The sky above is pale and vast, often hazy with dust blown from the edges of glaciers hundreds of miles away. The air is dry and sharp, so cold it makes your lungs ache, but so clean it seems to ring like crystal when you breathe. And everywhere you look, there is movement. Not the hurried scurrying of modern wildlife, but the slow, deliberate progress of creatures who measure time not in minutes or hours, but in seasons and migrations. This was the world of the Megafauna, the great beasts whose very existence challenges our understanding of what life on Earth can be. When we see a modern elephant, we think we're looking at something large, but the straight-tusked elephant of the Pleistocene was half again as tall, with tusks that curved like architectural features, like the flying buttresses of some cathedral built of bone and ivory. The cave bear, sleeping through winters in caverns that still echo with their presence, was not just larger than modern bears, but built along entirely different principles. Their skulls were massive, their teeth adapted for grinding through the toughest vegetation, their bodies designed to store fat enough to survive hibernations that might last 8 months of the year. And then there were the predators. The cave lion, padding silently across the tundra on paws the size of dinner plates, was nearly twice the weight of any lion alive today. The short-faced bear of North America stood 12 feet tall on its hind legs, with legs so long it could probably outrun a horse. These were not just bigger versions of animals we know. They were creatures adapted to a world where size itself was a survival strategy, where being large enough meant being too dangerous to challenge. But perhaps most alien of all was the landscape itself. Where we see forests, there were grasslands. Where we see coastlines, there was dry land stretching for hundreds of miles. The very shape of the continents was different, carved by ice sheets so massive they pressed the Earth's crust down under their weight, leaving scars that are still visible today in the rolling hills and scattered boulders of the northern territories. This was not a dead world locked in permanent winter. It breathed with the seasons, though those seasons moved to a different rhythm than ours. Springs that might last 3 months saw explosions of life and growth that supported vast herds. Summers, brief but intense, allowed young animals to grow strong enough to survive the coming cold, and winters, long and testing, separated the adapted from the merely hopeful. To understand this world, we have to let go of our modern assumptions about what Earth should look like. We have to imagine a planet where the familiar is strange and the impossible is everyday, where the footprint of a ground sloth might be the size of a coffee table, where the roar of a saber-toothed cat could be heard for miles across the empty steppes. This was not a simpler world. In many ways, it was more complex than ours, woven together by relationships between predator and prey, climate and creature that had been refined over millions of years. It was a world in balance, but a balance maintained at the very edges of survival, where every winter was a test and every spring a renewal. As we settle deeper into this story, we'll walk among these giants, feel the ground shake under their footsteps, and try to understand how a world so different from ours could have been, for millions of years, home to creatures whose very existence seems to belong to dreams rather than to the sober history of our planet. The giants did not emerge overnight. They were shaped by time itself, sculpted by millions of years of ice and wind and the relentless pressure of survival. To understand how massive these creatures became, we need to understand why the Pleistocene world demanded such size and how life responded to those demands with innovations that seem almost architectural in their ambition. The Pleistocene epoch began roughly 2.6 million years ago, when the Earth's climate entered a new phase of instability. Ice sheets began their slow dance of advance and retreat across the northern continents, creating a world of extremes that would persist for over 2 million years. But rather than making life impossible, these extremes made certain kinds of life inevitable. Size, it turned out, was one of the most effective answers to the challenges of the Ice Age world. Large animals could store more energy in their bodies, crucial for surviving the long winters when food was scarce. They lost heat more slowly than small animals, thanks to their favorable ratio of surface area to body mass. And they could travel farther in search of food, crossing vast landscapes that would be insurmountable for smaller creatures. But the giants of the Pleistocene were not simply enlarged versions of modern animals. They were evolutionary masterpieces, each one a unique solution to the specific challenges of their time and place. The woolly mammoth, perhaps the most iconic of the Ice Age giants, was not just a hairy elephant. Its ears were smaller to reduce heat loss. Its blood contained special proteins that worked efficiently in cold temperatures, and its curved tusks were perfectly designed for sweeping snow away from the vegetation beneath. The giant beaver of North America was the size of a black bear, with teeth that never stopped growing and a tail that was more like a canoe paddle than anything we see today. It built dams that could alter entire river systems, creating the wetlands and marshes that supported dozens of other species. These beavers were ecosystem engineers on a scale that modern beavers, impressive as they are, can barely approximate. In South America, ground sloths the size of elephants moved through forests on claws that could tear down trees. The largest of them, Megafauna, weighed as much as 4 tons and stood on its hind legs to reach vegetation 20 feet off the ground. Their claws, some over a foot long, were not just tools for digging, but weapons that could deter even the largest predators. The terror birds of South America represented a different approach to gigantism. These flightless predators stood 10 feet tall, with beaks like axes and legs that could propel them at speeds approaching 50 miles per hour. They were the apex predators of their environment for millions of years, proving that size and speed could be combined in ways that modern ecosystems cannot support. But perhaps the most alien of the Pleistocene giants were the marsupials of Australia. The diprotodon, a herbivore the size of a rhinoceros, was essentially a giant wombat with a skull 3 feet long. The marsupial lion, despite its name, was not closely related to any modern cat, but represented an entirely different evolutionary solution to the problem of being a large predator. Its teeth were like bolt cutters, designed to shear through bone and hide with mechanical precision. What made these giants possible was not just the climate, but the abundance it created. The grasslands of the Pleistocene were among the most productive ecosystems in Earth's history. The cold, dry conditions and seasonal patterns of growth created vast expanses of nutritious grasses that could support enormous herds of grazers. And where there were large herbivores, large carnivores inevitably followed. The relationship between these giants and their environment was not one way. The large herbivores shaped their landscapes just as much as they were shaped by them. Mammoth herds could trample forests into grasslands, maintaining the open habitats they preferred. Giant ground sloths dispersed seeds across vast distances, influencing the composition of entire forests. The cave bear's hibernation caves became repositories of nutrients that supported unique plant communities. This was ecosystem engineering on a grand scale, but it was also vulnerable. These giants had evolved in close relationship with specific climate conditions and vegetation patterns. They were, in many ways, too perfectly adapted to their world. When that world began to change, as it inevitably would, their very perfection would become their weakness. But for millions of years, they thrived. The Pleistocene giants represented life at its most ambitious, pushing the boundaries of what was physically possible. They were living proof that evolution, given enough time and the right pressures, could create creatures that challenge our understanding of biology itself. As we continue our journey into their world, we'll walk alongside these giants, trying to imagine what it would have felt like to share the landscape with creatures whose footsteps could be felt through the ground, whose calls carried for miles across the open steppes, and whose very presence transformed the world around them. The cold that shaped these giants came in waves, each one lasting tens of thousands of years. But the Pleistocene was not a single unending winter. It was a symphony of climate changes, with movements that alternated between ice and warmth, creating a world that was constantly being remade. Understanding this rhythm is crucial to understanding how life not only survived, but flourished during this most dramatic period in recent Earth history. The Ice Ages, as we call them, were driven by subtle changes in Earth's orbit and rotation. Over periods of tens of thousands of years, the planet's path around the sun would shift slightly, altering the amount and distribution of solar energy reaching different parts of the globe. These changes were small in absolute terms, but their effects were amplified by feedback loops that could transform the entire planet. When northern summers became slightly cooler, snow that had fallen during the winter might not completely melt. Year after year, this snow would accumulate, compacting into ice. As the ice sheets grew, they reflected more sunlight back into space, cooling the planet further. The cooler temperatures meant more snow, which meant more ice, which meant more reflection, in a cycle that could lock the planet into an ice age for thousands of years. But the ice ages were not uniform. They came in cycles, driven by the complex interactions of Earth's orbital variations. Roughly every 100,000 years, a major glaciation would spread ice sheets across much of North America and northern Europe. These were separated by shorter, warmer periods called interglacials, when the ice would retreat and forests would reclaim the land. Within these major cycles were smaller fluctuations, periods of warming and cooling that might last a few thousand years. And within those were even smaller variations, decades or centuries of unusual cold or warmth that could transform entire ecosystems. The result was a world in constant flux, where adaptation meant not just surviving one set of conditions, but being flexible enough to thrive as those conditions changed. The ice sheets themselves were not static walls of frozen water. They were dynamic systems, flowing like slow rivers from their centers toward their edges. The Laurentide ice sheet, which covered most of Canada and reached deep into what is now the United States, was in some places more than 2 miles thick. The weight of this ice was so great that it pressed the Earth's crust down, creating depressions that we can still measure today. At their maximum extent, these ice sheets locked up so much of the world's water that sea levels dropped by more than 400 feet. Vast areas that are now ocean floor were exposed as dry land, creating bridges between continents and opening new pathways for the migration of plants and animals. The Bering Land Bridge, which connected Asia and North America, was not a narrow strip but a vast plain hundreds of miles wide, supporting its own unique ecosystems. The effects of these ice sheets extended far beyond their edges. They altered wind patterns, redirecting storms and changing the distribution of rainfall. They affected ocean currents, which in turn influenced climate patterns around the globe. Even in regions that never saw ice, the presence of the great sheets transformed the landscape, creating deserts where forests had been, or turning temperate regions into Arctic tundra. But perhaps most importantly for life, the ice ages created a world of edges and transitions. At the margins of the ice sheets, where frozen ground met unfrozen, unique ecosystems developed. These edge environments were often more productive than either pure tundra or pure forest, supporting diverse communities of plants and animals. The Mammoth Steppe, the vast grassland that stretched from Western Europe across Siberia and into North America, was one such edge environment. Neither true tundra nor true grassland, it was a unique ecosystem that existed only during the ice ages. The cold, dry conditions and seasonal extremes created a landscape that could support enormous herds of large grazers, but only those specifically adapted to its demands. As the ice advanced and retreated, these ecosystems moved with it. During glacial periods, the Mammoth Steppe expanded, supporting its characteristic fauna across vast areas. During interglacials, forests would advance from the south, fragmenting the grasslands and forcing the Ice Age specialists into smaller and smaller refugia. This constant movement, this endless cycle of expansion and contraction, was the engine that drove much of the evolution of the Pleistocene giants. Species that could adapt to changing conditions, that could migrate long distances, that could survive in a variety of habitats, were the ones that thrived. Those that became too specialized, too dependent on specific conditions, were vulnerable when those conditions inevitably changed. The climate of the ice ages was not just about cold. It was about variability, unpredictability, and the constant need to adapt. It created a world where flexibility was more valuable than perfection, where survival often meant being good enough at many things rather than excellent at one thing. As we move deeper into this ancient world, we'll see how different species responded to these challenges, how some became masters of adaptation, while others, despite their size and apparent dominance, carried within themselves the seeds of their own extinction. In this world of constant change, where ice sheets advanced and retreated like slow tides, plant life faced challenges that would have tested the limits of adaptation. Yet, rather than simply enduring, vegetation evolved into forms that were uniquely suited to the strange rhythms of the Ice Age world. These were not the familiar forests and grasslands we know today. but plant communities that existed nowhere else in Earth's history. The mammoth steppe represented perhaps the most distinctive vegetation of the Pleistocene. This was not grassland as we understand it today, nor was it the tundra that now covers much of the Arctic. It was something in between, a unique plant community that could only exist under the specific conditions created by the Ice Age climate. The mammoth steppe represented perhaps the most distinctive vegetation of the Pleistocene. This was not grassland as we understand it today, nor was it the tundra that now covers much of the Arctic. It was something in between, a unique plant community that could only exist under the specific conditions created by the Ice Age climate. The grasses of the mammoth steppe were different from their modern relatives. They grew in dense mats, their root systems intertwining to create a tough, resilient surface that could withstand both the trampling of massive herbivores and the grinding force of seasonal frost. These grasses were exceptionally nutritious, packed with proteins and fats that could sustain large animals through the long winters. Mixed among the grasses were herbs and small shrubs that added diversity to the diet of the herbivores. Arctic sage, with its silvery leaves and aromatic oils, provided essential nutrients. Wild onions and other bulbs stored energy underground, available to any animal clever enough to dig them up. Small willows hugged the ground, their flexible branches bending with the wind rather than breaking. This vegetation was remarkably productive despite the harsh conditions. The short, intense growing seasons meant that plants had to concentrate their growth into just a few months each year. When the brief summer arrived, the steppe would explode into activity. Plants that had been dormant under the snow would emerge and grow with startling speed, taking advantage of the long daylight hours and the nutrients released by melting ice. The relationship between plants and animals in this ecosystem was more intimate than in most modern environments. The large herbivores were not just consumers of vegetation, they were partners in its creation. Their grazing stimulated new growth. Their trampling prevented the accumulation of dead plant matter that could choke out new shoots, and their dung provided fertilizer that enriched the soil. Mammoths, in particular, were ecosystem engineers. Their feeding habits prevented forests from encroaching on the grasslands. They would push down trees, strip bark, and create clearings that favored the growth of grasses and herbs. In winter, they would use their curved tusks to sweep away snow, exposing vegetation not just for themselves, but for smaller animals that followed in their wake. But the plant life of the Pleistocene was not limited to the mammoth steppe. In the warmer refugia that persisted even during the height of the glaciations, different plant communities thrived. These were often compressed versions of more familiar ecosystems, forests and woodlands that had been pushed into small areas where the climate remained suitable. These refugia were crucial for the survival of many plant species during the ice ages. Trees that could not survive on the open steppe found shelter in protected valleys or on south-facing slopes where the microclimate was milder. When the ice retreated and conditions warmed, these refugia served as the source populations from which forests could recolonize the newly available land. The trees that survived the ice ages were often different from their pre-glacial ancestors. They had been selected for cold tolerance, for the ability to grow quickly when conditions were favorable, and for resilience in the face of sudden climate changes. Many developed the ability to reproduce at an early age, ensuring that they could take advantage of brief windows of favorable conditions. In some cases, entire plant communities evolved that had no modern analogs. The spruce pine forests of glacial North America contained species mixtures that do not occur anywhere today. These were transitional communities adapted to the specific conditions that existed at the margins of the ice sheets. The flowers of the Ice Age world were often small and inconspicuous, adapted to the short growing seasons and harsh conditions, but they were remarkably diverse, with many species that specialized in exploiting the brief windows of opportunity that the climate provided. Some bloomed immediately after snowmelt, completing their entire life cycle in just a few weeks. Others remained dormant for years, waiting for exactly the right combination of temperature and moisture to trigger their growth. Even in the depths of winter, plant life found ways to persist. Some species developed the ability to photosynthesize under snow, using the faint light that filtered through the white covering. Others stored so much energy in their roots that they could survive multiple years of poor growing conditions. The plant communities of the Pleistocene were masterpieces of adaptation, finely tuned to the rhythms of ice and warmth that defined their world. They created the foundation upon which the entire ecosystem of giants rested, converting sunlight and simple nutrients into the energy that powered one of the most spectacular arrays of large animals in Earth's history. As the climate changed and the ice ages came to an end, many of these plant communities disappeared as completely as the animals they had supported. They exist now only in the genetic memories of their descendants and in the fossilized pollen that settles quietly in the layers of ancient lake beds, waiting for scientists to read their story. The giants of the Pleistocene were not just large, they were social. Across the mammoth steppes and in the forests at the margins of the ice, complex societies of massive animals played out dramas of cooperation, competition, and survival that rivaled anything in the modern world. Understanding these social structures gives us insight not just into how these animals lived, but into how they managed to thrive in one of the most challenging environments in Earth's history. Mammoth herds were perhaps the most sophisticated of these Ice Age societies. Like modern elephants, mammoths lived in matriarchal groups led by the oldest and most experienced females. These matriarchs carried within their memories the locations of water sources, the timing of seasonal migrations, and the safe routes through dangerous terrain. In a world where a wrong decision could mean death for an entire herd, this accumulated wisdom was literally a matter of life and death. But mammoth society was more complex than a simple family group. During the brief summers, when food was abundant and the living was relatively easy, multiple family groups would come together to form enormous aggregations. These summer gatherings served multiple purposes. They were opportunities for mating, for young animals to learn from adults outside their immediate family, and for the exchange of information about conditions across the vast landscape. Archaeological evidence suggests that these mammoth gatherings could involve hundreds of individuals spread across miles of steppe. The trampling from such groups was so extensive that it could alter the vegetation patterns of entire valleys. These were not just random collections of animals, they were organized societies with clear hierarchies and social rules. The mammoth's social bonds extended beyond their own species. Paleontologists have found evidence that mammoth herds were often accompanied by other species in what ecologists call mixed species associations. Woolly rhinoceros, steppe bison, and wild horses would travel with mammoth groups, taking advantage of the mammoth's ability to find food and water and of their vigilance against predators. These associations were mutually beneficial. The smaller animals could access food that the mammoths uncovered, while their presence increased the overall vigilance of the group. More eyes and ears meant earlier detection of approaching predators. In the harsh world of the Ice Age, even apex herbivores could not afford to be complacent. Ground sloths, despite their reputation for being slow and solitary, also formed complex social groups. The largest species appear to have lived in small family units that would congregate at certain times of the year. Fossil evidence from caves in South America suggests that these gatherings were associated with specific feeding sites or seasonal migrations. The social behavior of these giant sloths was probably quite different from that of modern sloths. Their large size meant they had little to fear from most predators, which may have allowed them to develop more open, less secretive social behaviors. They appear to have engaged in elaborate scent-marking behaviors, leaving chemical signals that could communicate their presence to other sloths across large areas. Perhaps most intriguingly, some evidence suggests that ground sloths engaged in cooperative behaviors. Fossil trackways show multiple individuals moving together along the same routes, possibly helping each other navigate difficult terrain or sharing information about food sources. The predators of the Pleistocene also lived in complex social groups. Cave lions appear to have hunted in coordinated prides, much like modern lions, but on a much larger scale. The size of their prey meant that cooperation was not just advantageous, but necessary. A single cave lion, even one weighing 700 pounds, would have had difficulty bringing down a healthy adult mammoth. But a pride working together could overwhelm even the largest herbivores. Dire wolves took pack hunting to new extremes. Fossil evidence from the La Brea tar pits in California shows that dire wolf packs could include dozens of individuals. These massive packs could take on prey that would be impossible for smaller groups to handle, but they also required sophisticated social organization to prevent conflicts within the group and to coordinate their hunting strategies. The social behaviors of these predators were probably more complex than those of their modern relatives. The harsh conditions of the Ice Age meant that cooperation was often a matter of survival. Pack members had to share resources during times of scarcity, care for each other's young, and work together to defend territory against rival groups. Even among the herbivores, social interactions were shaped by the unique challenges of the Ice Age world. Giant beavers, despite being primarily aquatic, formed colonies that could include multiple generations. These colonies worked together to build and maintain the massive dams that were essential to their survival. The engineering projects undertaken by these colonies were among the most ambitious undertaken by any non-human species. Musk oxen, one of the few Ice Age species to survive to the present day, perfected the art of collective defense. When threatened, they would form defensive circles with the young animals in the center and the adults facing outward, their horns presenting a formidable barrier to predators. This behavior was so effective that it allowed relatively small herds to survive in areas where individual animals would have been vulnerable. The social bonds formed by these Ice Age giants were not just practical arrangements for survival. Evidence suggests that many species formed emotional attachments similar to those seen in modern large mammals. Mammoth graveyards, where multiple individuals of different ages died together, suggest that these animals cared for their sick and elderly, sometimes staying with dying family members even when it put the entire group at risk. These social behaviors were crucial to the success of the Pleistocene giants. In a world where individual survival was already pushed to its limits, cooperation provided the edge that made thriving possible. The complex societies of the Ice Age were as much a part of these animals' adaptation as their thick fur or large size. As we'll see, when the climate began to change and the Ice Age world started to disappear, it was often the breakdown of these social structures that proved to be the final blow to species that had survived millions of years of environmental challenges. In the world of Ice Age giants, death was never far away, but neither was it random. Predation in the Pleistocene was an art form refined by millions of years of evolution, creating some of the most sophisticated hunting strategies and most formidable predators in Earth's history. The stakes were higher than in any modern ecosystem, the prey larger and more dangerous, the predators more powerful and more cunning. The saber-toothed cats represent perhaps the pinnacle of Pleistocene predation. Their famous canine teeth, some growing to 7 inches in length, were not simply oversized fangs, but precision instruments evolved for a specific purpose. These cats did not hunt the way modern big cats do. Their elongated canines were too fragile for the crushing bites that lions or tigers use to subdue their prey. Instead, they were designed for a single, perfectly placed strike to the throat or belly of their victim. Smilodon, the most famous of the saber-toothed cats, was built like a wrestler rather than a runner. Its forelimbs were extraordinarily powerful, equipped with partially retractable claws that could grapple with prey many times its own size. The hunting strategy was elegant in its simplicity. Use overwhelming strength to pin down the prey, then deliver a precise bite to the major blood vessels with those gleaming sabers. But this specialization came with costs. Saber-toothed cats were ambush predators, dependent on getting close to their prey undetected. In the open grasslands of the mammoth steppe, this meant waiting by water sources, along game trails, or in the sparse cover provided by boulder fields and scrubland. A failed ambush meant going hungry, and in the Ice Age world, going hungry too often meant death. The cave lions of Eurasia and North America took a different approach. Larger than any modern cat, they combined the cooperative hunting strategies of lions with the power needed to bring down megafauna. Cave lion prides could coordinate complex hunts, with some individuals driving prey toward others lying in ambush. Their jaw strength was phenomenal, capable of crushing the spine of a young mammoth with a single bite. Unlike their saber-toothed contemporaries, cave lions were pursuit predators as well as ambush hunters. Their long legs and powerful hindquarters allowed them to chase down prey across considerable distances. This versatility made them one of the most successful predators of the Pleistocene, with a range that extended from Western Europe to eastern North America. The short-faced bear of North America represents an entirely different approach to predation. Standing 12 feet tall on its hind legs and weighing up to 1,500 pounds, it was less a bear than a giant running carnivore. Its long legs suggest it could outrun most of its prey, while its massive skull and bone-crushing teeth indicate it could handle prey of almost any size. Some paleontologists believe the short-faced bear was primarily a scavenger, using its size and speed to drive other predators away from their kills. Others argue it was an active hunter, capable of pursuing everything from ground sloths to young mammoths across the open grasslands. Its extinction at the end of the Pleistocene removed one of the most formidable predators ever to walk the earth. But perhaps the most sophisticated hunters of the Ice Age were the dire wolves. These were not simply large wolves, they were specialized pack hunters that evolved specifically for bringing down megafauna. Their teeth were broader and more robust than those of modern wolves, designed for cracking the massive bones of their prey. Their jaw muscles were more powerful, their necks thicker, their overall build more massive. Dire wolf packs could include 30 or more individuals, allowing them to coordinate hunts of unprecedented complexity. They could surround and isolate individual animals from herds, harry large prey until exhaustion, and overwhelm even the most formidable herbivores through sheer numbers and persistence. The fossil record from sites like Rancho La Brea shows that dire wolves were remarkably successful, but also that their specialization for hunting megafauna would ultimately prove to be their downfall. The predation strategies of the Ice Age were not limited to mammals. The terror birds of South America, despite being flightless, were among the most formidable predators of their time. Standing 10 feet tall and weighing up to 1,000 pounds, they combined the speed of an ostrich with the killing power of a giant eagle. Their beaks were like axes, capable of delivering bone-crushing blows to the skulls of their prey. These birds were pursuit predators, using their powerful legs to run down ground sloths, early horses, and other herbivores across the pampas. Their hunting strategy was simple but effective. Overtake the prey through superior speed, then deliver a killing blow to the head or neck with their massive beaks. Marine predators of the Ice Age were no less impressive. Megalodons, giant sharks up to 60 feet in length, patrolled the coastal waters where many land animals came to drink. The Ice Age also saw the evolution of massive marine crocodiles and other aquatic predators that could take advantage of the land animals forced to cross rivers and coastlines during their migrations. What made Pleistocene predation so remarkable was not just the size of the predators, but the sophistication of their hunting strategies. These were not simple giants blundering through the landscape. They were precision instruments evolved for specific ecological niches. Each predator had found its own solution to the challenge of making a living in a world of giants. The relationship between predator and prey during the Ice Age was a constant arms race. As herbivores grew larger and developed better defenses, predators evolved new strategies and more powerful weapons. As predators became more formidable, herbivores developed more sophisticated social behaviors and defensive strategies. This evolutionary arms race created some of the most spectacular examples of adaptation in the fossil record. But it also created vulnerabilities. When the climate began to change and the Ice Age ecosystem started to collapse, many of these highly specialized predators found themselves without the specific prey they had evolved to hunt. Their very perfection became their weakness. As we continue our journey through the Pleistocene world, we'll see how the intricate relationships between predator and prey, built up over millions of years, began to unravel as the Ice Age drew to its close. Among all the giants that roamed the Pleistocene world, none captures our imagination quite like the woolly mammoth. These were not simply elephants with fur, they were masterpieces of adaptation, creatures so perfectly evolved for their Ice Age environment that they seemed almost designed by the cold itself. To understand the mammoth is to understand how life can transform itself to meet even the most extreme challenges nature can provide. The first thing that strikes you about a woolly mammoth is not its size, though they were indeed massive, but its almost architectural perfection. Every aspect of their anatomy was a solution to a specific problem posed by life in the Ice Age world. Their famous coat was not just long hair, but a sophisticated thermal regulation system. The outer guard hairs, some reaching nearly 3 feet in length, shed water and snow, while underneath, a dense layer of wool provided insulation so effective that mammoths could maintain their body temperature even when the air dropped to minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit. Their ears, dramatically smaller than those of modern elephants, were an elegant solution to the problem of heat loss. Large ears, so useful for cooling in the African heat, would have been a liability in the Arctic cold. Mammoth ears were small, fur-lined, and designed to retain rather than dissipate heat. Even their tails were shorter and thicker than those of their tropical relatives, reducing the surface area exposed to the freezing air. But perhaps the most remarkable adaptation was hidden in their blood. Mammoth hemoglobin was subtly different from that of modern elephants, designed to release oxygen more efficiently at low temperatures. This meant that even when their extremities were cold enough to slow circulation, their muscles and organs could still receive the oxygen they needed to function. The mammoth's famous curved tusks were not just impressive ornaments, but essential tools for survival. Unlike the relatively straight tusks of modern elephants, mammoth tusks curved in dramatic spirals that were perfectly designed for sweeping snow away from vegetation. During the long winter months when grass and herbs lay buried under feet of snow, these tusks were literally the difference between eating and starving. The mammoth's trunk, while similar in structure to that of modern elephants, was adapted for picking up objects from the ground while the head was held high. This allowed mammoths to maintain vigilance for predators even while feeding. The trunk tip had specialized projections that could manipulate small objects with remarkable precision, essential for selecting the most nutritious parts of the sparse vegetation available during winter. Mammoth society was built around the accumulated wisdom of the eldest females. These matriarchs carried in their memories the locations of seasonal feeding grounds, the timing of migrations, and the safe routes through treacherous terrain. In a world where a wrong turn could lead a herd into a blizzard or toward a group of waiting predators, this knowledge was more valuable than any physical adaptation. The social bonds within mammoth herds were extraordinarily strong. Families would travel together for decades, with multiple generations learning from each other. When a mammoth died, the survivors would often return to the site repeatedly, touching the bones with their trunks in what can only be described as mourning behavior. Some paleontologists believe mammoths may have had primitive burial behaviors, covering their dead with vegetation and stones. But mammoths were not the only mastodons of their time. The American mastodon, while smaller than its woolly cousin, was equally well adapted to its forest environment. Where mammoths evolved for the open steppes, mastodons were creatures of the woodlands that fringed the ice sheets. Their straighter tusks and differently shaped teeth were perfect for stripping bark and breaking branches, allowing them to exploit food sources that mammoths could not access. Mastodons were more solitary than mammoths, living in smaller family groups that could navigate through dense forests more easily than large herds. Their feet were broader and more cushioned, designed for walking on the soft forest floor rather than the hard-packed earth of the steppes. Even their trunks were adapted differently, with more sensitive tips that could distinguish between edible and poisonous plants in the complex forest environment. The relationship between mammoths and mastodons illustrates one of the key principles of Ice Age ecology: specialization. Each species found its own niche, its own way of making a living in the challenging world of the Pleistocene. This specialization allowed multiple related species to coexist without competing directly, but it also made each species vulnerable when their specific environment began to change. The woolly rhinoceros was another master of Ice Age adaptation. Unlike modern rhinos, which are primarily browsers, woolly rhinos were grazers, competing directly with mammoths for food on the open steppes. Their approach to this competition was to become more efficient grazers, developing teeth that could process the tough steppe grasses more effectively than mammoth teeth could. Woolly rhinos were solitary animals, coming together only to mate. This lifestyle made sense in an environment where food was often scattered and where large groups would quickly exhaust local resources. Their thick, shaggy coat was different from that of mammoths, with shorter outer hair but an even denser undercoat. Their horn, made of compressed hair rather than bone, was flattened and curved, perfect for sweeping snow away from vegetation. The most remarkable thing about woolly rhinos was their ability to survive in areas too cold even for mammoths. They ranged farther north into regions where the permafrost never thawed and where winter temperatures regularly dropped below -50 degrees Fahrenheit. They were, in many ways, the ultimate Ice Age specialists. Giant beavers represented yet another approach to Ice Age survival. Rather than adapting to the cold by developing thick fur and large body size, they adapted by modifying their environment. These beavers, some weighing over 200 pounds, built dams and lodges on a scale that dwarfs anything modern beavers attempt. Their engineering projects created wetland ecosystems that could support dozens of other species. The ponds they created provided open water even in winter, serving as refugia for fish, amphibians, and aquatic plants that might otherwise have been frozen out. Their lodges were architectural marvels, multi-chambered structures that could house extended families through the long winter months. But perhaps the most alien of the Ice Age herbivores were the ground sloths. These were not the slow-hanging creatures we associate with the name today, but massive terrestrial animals that combined the size of elephants with the claws of giant anteaters. The largest species, Megatherium, weighed up to 6 tons and stood over 12 feet tall when rearing up on its hind legs. Ground sloths were ecosystem engineers in their own right. Their massive claws, some over a foot long, were not weapons but tools for digging and manipulating their environment. They could excavate massive burrows, some large enough to drive a car through, that served as shelters for themselves and dozens of other species. They could also tear down trees, creating clearings that favored the growth of their preferred food plants. The relationship between ground sloths and their environment was so intimate that when they disappeared, entire ecosystems collapsed. The trees they had controlled grew unchecked, the clearings they had maintained filled in with forest, and the seed dispersal networks they had maintained broke down. Each of these giants represents a different solution to the challenges of Ice Age life. They were not random experiments in large size, but carefully evolved responses to specific environmental pressures. Their success lay not just in their individual adaptations, but in the way they fit together to create functioning ecosystems. Yet this very integration would prove to be their vulnerability. When the climate began to change at the end of the Pleistocene, it was not enough for individual species to adapt. Entire ecosystems had to reorganize, and many of the relationships that had made the giants possible began to break down. The woolly mammoth, master of the Ice Age world, would find that expertise in one environment does not guarantee survival when that environment disappears. The story of their decline is also the story of how perfectly adapted creatures can become victims of their own success. As we follow these giants toward the end of their time, we begin to see the first signs of the changes that would transform their world and ultimately bring the age of Megafauna to a close. The end did not come suddenly. Like the ice ages themselves, the extinction of the giants was a process that unfolded over thousands of years, driven by forces so gradual that no single generation would have perceived the full scope of the change. Yet by the time it was complete, the world had been transformed as dramatically as if it had been struck by an asteroid. The first signs of trouble appeared around 15,000 years ago, as the climate began its final shift toward the warmer, more stable conditions we know today. The great ice sheets that had dominated the northern continents for over 100,000 years began their final retreat, releasing vast quantities of meltwater that raised sea levels and altered ocean currents around the globe. For the giants of the Pleistocene, this warming brought mixed consequences. In some ways, it created new opportunities. Areas that had been locked under ice for millennia became available for colonization. New plant communities emerged, and some animal populations initially expanded into these fresh territories. But the warming also brought fundamental changes to the ecosystems that had supported the megafauna. The mammoth steppe, that vast grassland that had stretched across continents, began to fragment as forests advanced from the south. The cold, dry conditions that had favored grasses gave way to warmer, moister climates that favored trees. This change was catastrophic for species like mammoths and woolly rhinos, which had evolved specifically for life on open grasslands. As forests spread, their habitat shrank and became increasingly fragmented. Populations that had once been connected across vast distances found themselves isolated in shrinking islands of suitable habitat. The changes were not uniform across the globe. In some regions, the transition was relatively gradual, allowing some adaptation and migration. In others, it was rapid and dramatic. The Younger Dryas period, a brief return to near-glacial conditions around 12,900 years ago, created a particularly challenging period of climate instability that may have pushed many already stressed populations over the edge. But climate change alone does not fully explain the pattern of extinctions that marked the end of the Pleistocene. If warming temperatures were the only factor, we would expect to see gradual decline rather than the relatively rapid disappearance that characterized many species. We would also expect small species to be affected as much as large ones, since they were equally dependent on the same ecosystems. Instead, the extinction pattern shows a clear bias toward large animals. Across every continent, it was the giants that disappeared first and most completely. Small mammals, birds, and reptiles generally survived the transition, often with little apparent difficulty. This pattern suggests that size itself became a liability during the end Pleistocene crisis. Large animals face inherent disadvantages during environmental crises. They need more food, more space, and more time to reproduce than smaller animals. They are less able to hide from predators or environmental extremes, and their populations are naturally smaller and more vulnerable to chance events. During stable periods, these disadvantages are outweighed by the benefits of large size. During periods of rapid change, they become critical vulnerabilities. The role of human hunters in the megafaunal extinctions remains one of the most debated topics in paleontology. There is no doubt that humans were present during the period of extinctions and that they hunted large animals. Archaeological sites across the Americas, Europe, and Australia contain evidence of human predation on megafauna. The timing of human arrival in different regions often correlates closely with the timing of extinctions. In Australia, megafaunal extinctions began around 50,000 years ago, shortly after the first humans arrived on the continent. In the Americas, the extinctions accelerated around 13,000 years ago, coinciding with the appearance of the Clovis culture and its distinctive spear points. But the relationship between human hunting and extinction is complex. Humans had coexisted with megafauna in Africa and parts of Eurasia for hundreds of thousands of years without causing widespread extinctions. Why would they suddenly become more destructive during the end Pleistocene period? Part of the answer may lie in the combination of factors rather than any single cause. Climate change was already stressing megafaunal populations, making them more vulnerable to additional pressures. Human hunting, even at relatively low levels, might have been enough to push already struggling populations beyond the point of recovery. There's also evidence that human impacts extended beyond direct hunting. Humans used fire to modify landscapes, often burning forests to create more open habitats that favored certain prey species. These landscape modifications may have further fragmented habitats for megafauna, making it even more difficult for them to adapt to changing climate conditions. The social structure of megafaunal species may have made them particularly vulnerable to human hunting. Many of the giants lived in small populations with slow reproductive rates. The loss of even a few individuals per year could have been enough to send populations into irreversible decline. Perhaps most importantly, the hunting strategies developed by late Pleistocene humans were far more sophisticated than those used by earlier human populations. The development of projectile weapons, cooperative hunting techniques, and detailed knowledge of animal behavior made humans far more effective predators than they had ever been before. The extinction process was not uniform across species or regions. Some giants, like the Irish elk with its massive antlers, disappeared relatively early. Others, like certain populations of mammoths, survived thousands of years longer in isolated refugia. The last mammoths living on Wrangel Island in the Arctic Ocean did not die out until around 4,000 years ago, long after most of their relatives had vanished. These late survivors provide important clues about the extinction process. Isolated from both climate change and human hunting pressure, they were able to persist far longer than mainland populations. This suggests that the combination of factors, rather than any single cause, was responsible for most extinctions. The pattern of survival and extinction also reveals something important about the nature of the crisis. It was not simply that large animals were doomed by their size, but that the ecosystems they depended on were being fundamentally reorganized. Species that could adapt to new environments or that found themselves in stable refugia had a chance of survival. Those that were too specialized or too dependent on specific conditions did not. As the giants disappeared, their loss had cascading effects throughout their ecosystems. The mammoth steppe, deprived of the large herbivores that had maintained it, gave way to forest and tundra. Predators that had specialized in hunting megafauna either adapted to smaller prey or vanished themselves. Within a few thousand years, ecosystems that had been stable for millions of years were completely transformed. The age of giants was ending, and a new chapter in Earth's history was beginning. The transformation did not stop with the loss of individual species. As the giants disappeared, the very fabric of the ecosystems they had inhabited began to unravel and reorganize in ways that are still influencing the world today. When the last mammoth vanished from the Siberian mainland around 10,000 years ago, it took with it more than just a single species. Mammoths had been ecosystem engineers, their feeding and trampling, maintaining the grasslands that supported dozens of other species. Without their constant pruning, shrubs and eventually trees began to invade the open steppes. This vegetation change had profound consequences. The new forests reflected less sunlight than the pale grasslands had, causing local warming that accelerated the thaw of permafrost. As the permafrost melted, it released stored carbon dioxide and methane, contributing to further warming in a feedback loop that continues today. The loss of the mammoth steppe also meant the loss of the vast carbon storage system that those grasslands had represented. Prairie grasses store most of their carbon in their extensive root systems, creating one of the most carbon-rich soil types on Earth. As forests replaced grasslands, much of this stored carbon was released to the atmosphere. Some scientists argue that the end Pleistocene extinctions had a greater impact on global climate than most natural processes. The loss of millions of large herbivores across multiple continents may have contributed significantly to the warming that characterized the beginning of our current interglacial period. The disappearance of giant herbivores also transformed nutrient cycling in ecosystems around the world. Large animals are incredibly efficient at moving nutrients across landscapes. They consume plants in one area and deposit the nutrients in their dung elsewhere, often over distances of many miles. Whales provide a modern example of this process. They feed in nutrient-rich polar waters and then migrate to nutrient-poor tropical areas where they give birth and nurse their young. The nutrients they transport help support the productivity of entire ocean basins. The loss of terrestrial megafauna would have had similar but even more dramatic effects on land ecosystems. Ground sloths, for example, were crucial seed dispersers in South American forests. Their massive size allowed them to swallow fruits that were too large for any other animal to consume, and their long-distance movements spread these seeds across vast areas. When the ground sloths disappeared, many plant species lost their primary means of dispersal. Some of these plants still exist today, but they are evolutionary anachronisms, producing fruits that no living animal can properly utilize. The avocado is one example. Its large seed and nutritious flesh were likely evolved to be eaten by ground sloths and other megafauna that could swallow the entire fruit and deposit the seed far from the parent tree. The transformation of ecosystems after the megafaunal extinctions was not simply a matter of subtraction. New species and new ecological relationships emerged to fill some of the vacant niches, but the process took thousands of years and resulted in fundamentally different types of ecosystems. In North America, the disappearance of large herbivores led to the expansion of forests in many areas that had previously been grasslands. These forests supported different communities of small mammals, birds, and insects than the grasslands had. While biodiversity may not have decreased overall, it was reorganized in completely new ways. The loss of large predators had equally dramatic effects. With the disappearance of giant bears, cats, and wolves, the remaining predators faced less competition and were able to expand their ranges and diversify their hunting strategies. But they also lost access to the scavenging opportunities that megafauna carcasses had provided. Human societies were also transformed by the loss of the giants. For thousands of years, humans had based their cultures around hunting large animals. The disappearance of megafauna forced a fundamental reorganization of human subsistence strategies. In many parts of the world, the end of megafaunal hunting coincided with the development of agriculture. This was not necessarily a conscious choice, but may have been a necessity as traditional prey species disappeared. The transition to farming allowed human populations to grow and become more sedentary, setting the stage for the development of complex civilizations. But the loss of megafauna also meant the loss of opportunities for domestication. Many of the giants might have been suitable for domestication if they had survived. Imagine the possibilities if mammoths had been available as domestic animals. Their strength and cold tolerance could have opened vast Arctic regions to human settlement. The ecosystems that emerged after the extinctions were not necessarily less stable or less productive than those that had existed before, but they were fundamentally different. They were dominated by smaller animals, had different patterns of nutrient cycling, and different responses to environmental change. These new ecosystems were also more dependent on human management than the megafauna-dominated systems had been. In many regions, human activities like controlled burning became necessary to maintain the open habitats that some surviving species required. The rewilding movement in modern conservation represents an attempt to partially restore some of the ecological functions that were lost with the megafauna. By reintroducing large herbivores to landscapes where they had been absent, scientists hope to recreate some of the ecosystem processes that characterized the Pleistocene world. But complete restoration is impossible. Too many species are gone forever, and the climate and vegetation communities of today are too different from those of the Ice Age. We can create approximations of Pleistocene ecosystems, but we cannot truly bring back the world of giants. The transformation that followed the end Pleistocene extinctions was one of the most dramatic ecological reorganizations in Earth's history. It marked not just the end of individual species, but the end of an entire way of life that had characterized our planet for millions of years. As we reach the end of our journey through the world of giants, we find ourselves in the modern world, surrounded by the echoes and shadows of that vanished age. The ghosts of the Ice Age giants are all around us, though we rarely recognize them for what they are. Every landscape we see, every ecosystem we study, every conservation challenge we face carries within it the invisible influence of creatures that vanished thousands of years ago. Understanding these persistent echoes helps us comprehend not just where we came from, but where we might be heading. The most obvious remnants are the survivors, the handful of megafaunal species that managed to weather the end Pleistocene crisis. Elephants, the closest living relatives of mammoths and mastodons, still shape their environments in ways that echo their Ice Age cousins. In African savannas, elephants maintain open grasslands by preventing forest encroachment, much as mammoths once maintained the mammoth steppe. But modern elephants are conservative versions of their Ice Age relatives. African elephants, the largest living land animals, are smaller than many of their extinct cousins. They live in a world already shaped by human influence, their ranges restricted, and their ancient migration routes blocked by agriculture and development. Bison, another Ice Age survivor, provides an even more dramatic example of what has been lost. The vast herds that once darkened the Great Plains numbered in the tens of millions and extended from Alaska to Mexico. These herds were not just large groups of animals, they were moving ecosystems that shaped grasslands across an entire continent. The near extinction of bison in the 19th century was one of the most rapid and complete ecological collapses in recorded history. Within just a few decades, populations that had numbered in the millions were reduced to a few hundred individuals. The grassland ecosystems that had co-evolved with bison over thousands of years were suddenly deprived of their primary architect. While bison populations have recovered somewhat, they exist now in small managed herds that can only hint at their former ecological role. The grasslands they once maintained have been converted to agriculture or have reverted to different vegetation types that reflect their absence. Musk oxen, perhaps the most authentically Ice Age animal still alive, persist in the Arctic tundra that most closely resembles the mammoth steppe of the Pleistocene. These shaggy survivors have changed little since the time they shared the landscape with mammoths and woolly rhinos. They still form defensive circles when threatened, still migrate across vast distances following ancient routes, still endure Arctic winters that would challenge any modern technology. But even musk oxen live in a diminished world. Their range is a fraction of what it once was, and they compete with domestic reindeer for the tundra resources their ancestors had largely to themselves. The landscapes themselves carry the deepest imprints of the vanished giants. The Great Lakes of North America are mammoth-carved basins, gouged out by ice sheets and filled with meltwater as the Pleistocene ended. Every time we see these vast inland seas, we are looking at monuments to the Ice Age, though few people think of them that way. The fertile soils of the American Midwest and the European plains are another legacy of the Ice Age world. These deep, rich layers were built up over thousands of years by the dust blown from glacial margins and by the organic matter accumulated in mammoth-grazed grasslands. Modern agriculture depends on these soils, making our food system partially dependent on processes that ended 10,000 years ago. Even the vegetation communities we see today were shaped by the absent giants. Many North American and European forests exist where they do because mammoths and other large herbivores are no longer there to prevent their establishment. The open savannas of Africa persist partly because elephants and other large herbivores continue to fill some of the ecological roles that their Ice Age predecessors played. Some plants are more direct remnants of the Megafauna age. The honey locust trees of North America produce massive pods filled with sweet pulp, far too large for any living North American animal to consume whole. These pods were likely adapted for consumption by ground sloths and other large herbivores that could swallow them entirely and deposit the seeds far from the parent tree. Today, these pods fall to the ground and rot, their evolutionary purpose unfulfilled. The trees persist because they are long-lived and because humans have found uses for them, but they are evolutionary anachronisms, adapted for relationships that no longer exist. Modern conservation efforts often struggle with the legacy of the megafaunal extinctions. Many ecosystems are missing key functional groups, the large herbivores, ecosystem engineers, and top predators that once shaped their structure and function. Efforts to restore these ecosystems without these missing elements often fall short of their goals. The rewilding movement represents one attempt to address this challenge. By reintroducing large herbivores to landscapes where they have been absent, conservationists hope to restore some of the ecological processes that characterized pre-extinction ecosystems. European efforts to establish wild horse and cattle herds in nature reserves are examples of this approach. But true rewilding faces fundamental limitations. The climate is different now. Human land use has fragmented most landscapes, and many of the key species are simply gone forever. We can create approximations of ancient ecosystems, but we cannot truly recreate them. Climate change adds another layer of complexity to the legacy of the megafaunal extinctions. Some scientists argue that the loss of large herbivores contributed to global warming by allowing forests to replace grasslands, reducing the Earth's ability to reflect sunlight. The carbon stored in mammoth-grazed grasslands was released when those grasslands converted to forests and tundra. This suggests that the ecological changes initiated by the end Pleistocene extinctions may still be influencing global climate patterns today. The world we live in is not just post-Ice Age, it is post-megafauna, and that distinction may be more important than we have generally recognized. Human cultures also carry echoes of the megafaunal world. Creation myths from around the world often feature giant animals or reference times when animals were larger and more powerful than they are today. These stories may preserve distant cultural memories of actual encounters with megafauna, passed down through countless generations of oral tradition. The archaeological record shows that humans maintained cultural connections to mammoths and other extinct giants for thousands of years after their disappearance. Mammoth ivory continued to be traded and carved long after living mammoths had vanished. Images of mammoths appear in cave art and petroglyphs from periods when the artists could only have known these animals through cultural memory. Even today, extinct megafauna occupy a special place in human imagination. Mammoths, saber-toothed cats, and giant ground sloths are among the most recognizable prehistoric animals, their images appearing in everything from children's books to Hollywood movies. This cultural persistence suggests that the loss of the giants left a void in the human psyche as well as in global ecosystems. Modern technology has given us new ways to connect with these vanished creatures. Scientists can now extract DNA from frozen mammoth carcasses, analyze the contents of their stomachs, and even reconstruct their appearance with unprecedented accuracy. Some researchers are exploring the possibility of using genetic engineering to recreate mammoth-like creatures, though such efforts remain highly speculative. But perhaps the most important legacy of the Ice Age giants is what they teach us about the fragility of even the most impressive adaptations. These were not failed experiments in evolution. They were highly successful species that dominated their environments for millions of years. Their extinction reminds us that no adaptation, no matter how perfect, guarantees survival when environmental conditions change rapidly enough. This lesson has profound implications for modern conservation efforts. In an era of rapid climate change and ecosystem disruption, even our most iconic and seemingly robust species may be more vulnerable than they appear. The story of the megafaunal extinctions is not just ancient history. It is a preview of the challenges that contemporary wildlife faces in an increasingly human-dominated world. As we emerge from our journey into the world of giants, we carry with us the knowledge that the Earth has been many different things throughout its history. The stable, familiar world we know is just one snapshot in a much longer story of constant change and adaptation. The giants may be gone, but their story continues in the landscapes they shaped, the ecosystems they influenced, and the lessons they offer about the nature of life on a changing planet. In understanding their world, we better understand our own place in the continuing story of life on Earth. And so we return to the present, to a world that seems smaller somehow, having glimpsed what came before. The Ice Age giants remind us that Earth has hosted wonders we can barely imagine, and that our own time, for all its marvels, is just one chapter in a much grander tale. Tonight, as you settle into sleep, perhaps you can imagine them still, the mammoths moving across endless grasslands, their breath visible in the cold air, their ancient wisdom carried in the memories of the eldest females. The world they knew is gone, but the wonder they inspired remains, echoing through time like footsteps in snow that never melts, never quite disappears, never stops calling us back to remember what once was and what might someday be again. Sleep well, traveler through time. The giants are waiting in your dreams, where size is no barrier and extinction is just another word for the pause between one story and the next. In that timeless place where imagination meets memory, they walk still, and the world is vast enough to hold them all.